Happy Groundhog's Day. Did you know it's Groundhog's Day today? Where a rat tells everybody what the weather's going to be. You ever heard this before? Groundhog's Day. Little town in Pennsylvania, there's this groundhog. I don't know how they keep the same one alive. It must be like multiple groundhogs that do this, but there's this like tradition where every February 2nd in the morning, they take this rat out of the hole and they say, hey, rat, do you see your shadow or not? If it sees its shadow, that means it's like the sun's still out and it's not cloudy like it is in the springtime. So if it sees your shadow, they say, winter continues for 6 more weeks. And if they don't see their shadow, they say, it's springtime early. That's what they say. And there was a very famous movie that was made about Groundhog's Day, creatively called Groundhog's Day, okay? Made in the 90s before all of us were born. And, see, yeah, that was for leaders. Made before we were born. And it's like a comedy. And the whole point of this show, or this movie, is this guy wakes up every day and it's still the same day. The guy starts out not loving life. In fact, the guy starts out so upset, like he quits his job at the beginning. He does all these things and he goes to bed. And then guess what? The next morning, it's still February 2nd. That's what this movie is. And the plot of the movie is basically he like learns all these different things by reliving the same day over and over again. And the movie doesn't actually say how many times he relives this day over and over again. It's like he's kind of stuck there. Sorry, I'm giving you a spoiler. If you've never seen this movie, like, I guess it's a kind of a funny movie to watch. So, like, maybe you should go watch it. But this movie, he basically just stays in the same day. It doesn't say how long, but if you ask, like, super fans of this movie, they'll say that he stayed living the same day for like 27 to 30 to 35 years because of all the skills he acquired. So like he learns how to play piano. And it doesn't tell us like how long it took him, but the idea is he wakes up every day over and over again, same day, but his character develops over time, right? And I want you to think that although the text we're about to read today is not the same day lived over and over again, you might feel like Genesis brings the same stories over and over again. God's people get God's promises, and then what do? They don't always do the right thing. And then guess what? God has to teach them through that. And guess what? Next generation, you know what they're going to do? They're going to get God's promises, and they're going to fail to keep God's commandments, and they're going to learn over time. Like, this is the story of how we deal with our sanctification, how we grow in holiness is the New Testament way to put it. But I want you to see Jacob, a man who lives for a very long time. We're going to read 20 years of his life today. We've been usually going like one chapter at a time, but this morning we're going to cover 4 chapters of his life. And we're going to see a lot of character arc for him where he has to go through a lot of painful things, and then he's changed because of the painful things that gets brought in his life. And I want you to read it and think, you know what? That's very similar to the Christian experience. That as we go, we start with God's promises. We get God's gospel command at the beginning of our existence as a Christian. Then God shapes us and molds us over time. Sometimes using pain, sometimes using discipline, sometimes using heartbreak or loss. But it's all to get us to be the kind of people he wants us to be. So open a Bible. Let's look at Genesis chapter 28 this morning. That's where we're going to start. Genesis 28. And we're going to read about the life of Jacob. Now, here's what we know about Jacob so far. He's the younger one. There's Esau and there's Jacob. They're twins. Jacob was grasping at his brother's birthright, and he gets it. Then he grasps at his blessing, and he lies and deceives so that he can have his brother's blessing and birthright. And now, guess what? He has both. But as we studied last week, the process to get to that broke this whole family apart. So now Jacob is on the run. What we see at the beginning of chapter 28 is Isaac, his father, sends him out and says, okay, you can go back to where Rebekah is from. So now he goes back to where his mom comes from. And hopefully he'll find a wife there. And Isaac says, yeah, go for it. And then the text says that Esau saw this, that his parents didn't like the girls that were in their area. So he's like, well, maybe my parents want me to go to a distant relative and marry a distant relative. So he goes to Ishmael, which is like the bad guy. Where did Ishmael live? He lived to the east. So he goes to the east to try to find a bride there. Ishmael had already died at this point, so it's one of Ishmael's daughters who's alive, and he's like, he marries another person. And the whole point is like, Esau, you're missing the point, okay? This is not what your parents wanted. You're not walking in the Lord. But then we get to chapter 28, verse 10. That's where I want to start reading together. It says, Jacob left Beersheba, and that's where they all were. He left Beersheba and went towards Haran, so he's going north. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. How many times did the word place show up? A bunch, right? As a good reader of your Old Testament narrative, you know, if a word keeps getting repeated, that concept's going to be important. This place is very important. It says, and he dreamed, verse 12. And behold, there was a ladder that was set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. Have you ever been to like Knott's Berry Farm or the Orange County Fair? And there's that ladder that you have to climb, and it's like super wobbly. You know, you have to climb all the way up. You know what they call that? They call that Jacob's ladder, okay, because of this story in the Bible. Now, that's not the image that this is. Jacob's ladder in this situation is more like a ladder or a stairway that goes all the way up into heaven. This is what, in the ancient world, they would have thought they're big ziggurats that they made. Remember the Tower of Babel? They thought how, you know, if we just make this big building, we could just walk all the way up to God, right? And in Genesis 11, God said, you can't do that. But now, it's kind of strange. God shows Jacob this, like, stairway up to him, right? Even the phrase stairway to heaven, right? That's this, but it's a dream. What does he do? Does Jacob say, great, I'm going to go climb up to heaven? That's actually not what happens in this story. It says, and behold, the middle of verse 12, behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending, right? It's almost like an escalator, right? This is like an escalator to heaven, right? These angels are going up the stairs, and they're going down the stairs, right? Maybe some are going up and some are going down, right? That's the picture. That's the image. Right? And do you like how it has an exclamation point? Like, wow, crazy. This was happening. And behold, the Lord stood above it. Right? So now we got an image where Jacob in a dream is in this place. He's sleeping with his head on a rock. He's having this dream, and he sees this way to heaven that for all of human history had been barred, but now it's shown to him. That's also going to be important later on. And God's standing at the top. And God says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land, place, right, location, on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All 4 locations. Look at that. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That is what God promised to Abraham. So you know what this means for Jacob? Hey, all those promises, they're going to be done through you and through your descendants. Jacob is later going to be renamed Israel. And all the Israelites come from this guy right here. That's what had been promised before, right? But look at verse 15. Just to kind of add to the promises and just to kind of reassure Jacob. Look what God says in verse 15. This is Genesis 28:15. He says, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. So, what have we been talking about this before? Like, the place is so important. He falls asleep at this place, and God says, I'm going to give you this place. But then God says, you know what? Wherever you go, I will be with you. My presence is going with you. That's super important. And I will bring you back to this place, this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. Right? That's the dream. Then Jacob, verse 16, awoke from sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place. And I did not know it. Right? So he's kind of freaking out, like, I fell asleep in like some special place to God. Did I fall asleep in his temple or something? Like, that's the way he talks about it. And he was afraid. And he said, how awesome is this place? Do you see the repetition of this place? I'm trying to emphasize that to show you there's something significant about this place. And he says, and this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Like, this is access to God. Now, I think it's a mistake to think that this place is somehow the access to God, but I think it's super interesting to see right here that all these religions, all these worldviews, even in the ancient days, they were trying to reach God. The Tower of Babel was doing that. I mean, even today, think about, people talk about reaching enlightenment or reaching some kind of satisfaction or getting ultimate purpose in life. Like, humanity's always trying to reach God. And notice what God has to do over and over again, whether it's here in Genesis 28 or in the New Testament, he has to say, you can't come up here. I have to come down there. I have to show you a way to myself. This is a picture of God's grace. And if you think I'm just making that up, Jesus is actually going to quote this exact section to a guy named Nathaniel in the New Testament. He's going to say, you're going to see this kind of thing happen in your day through Jesus. Just amazing. All this takes place. It's a reminder of God's grace. Because what should God have said to Jacob? What's the last thing Jacob did right before this? Lied, cheated, stole the blessing, ruined his family. Like, what should God have met him with? A rebuke, right? God could have easily done that. God could have met him with a lot of things, but instead, he meets him with grace right here. And that's where I think there is a connection to the Christian experience. Right? You realize the message of Jesus Christ is not simply that we are sinners. That actually is something assumed. The gospel assumes that you already know you're a sinner. But the gospel is good news, and it's preached all throughout, all these places where people have the gospel. And it's basically this, that though you're a sinner, Christ died for you, and God has made a way for you to know him. That God, instead of meeting you with condemnation, also meets you with grace, a lot like Jacob. Jacob did not deserve God's grace, just like you don't deserve God's grace. But this is how awesome God is, that he meets us with grace even when we don't deserve it. So the first thing I want you to see, you see in your outline 4 points, and it's all see these things. The first thing I want you to see is that God's grace is in his promised presence. See God's grace in his promised presence. Because that was true for Jacob, but I just want you to think in the New Testament how clear it is that God promises to be with us, which is a wild, radical statement, right? Like, even in the ancient world, notice Jacob is all thinking like, I came into God's house, and then God says, nope, I'm going to go with you, though. That was foreign to the ancient understanding of gods, right? Gods were located. Gods were in certain places. Gods were in certain buildings. But the real God says, that's not how I operate. In fact, I go with my people wherever they go. I know that's so obvious to you if you grew up in a Christian household, or if you grew up with a Christian worldview, but it wasn't obvious back then. His promised presence. Keep reading, verse 18. It says, so early in the morning, after all this happened, and Jacob sees all this and thinks, wow, I got to do something about this. I need to respond. Look what he does. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. This is like rich symbolism. Like, this is important. And he called the name of the place Bethel. The word Bethel means house of God. And the name of the city was Luz at the first. That's what it was called. He renames it house of God, Bethel. Then Jacob made a vow. This is pretty interesting. So after God meets him and says, I'm going to be with you, what does Jacob respond with? Like, I want to do what you say. I want to respond. So he responds with a promise, a vow, a resolution. Here's what he says. If God will be with me, which is God's whole promise here. If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, right? Because he's sent off to go somewhere foreign, place he's never been, to his mom's homeland, to hopefully find a wife, right? He says, if God's with me, and if he gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house, so I come back here in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house, right? House of God, Bethel, so play on words. And all that you give me, God, like everything you give me, I'll give you a tenth of it, right? Which is what we already seen Abraham and Melchizedek. We already saw people giving back to God of what they've received. What's the point here? At the beginning of his life, when Jacob should receive a rebuke, what does God meet him with? Grace and a promise, right? Which is why I just see so many similarities between the life of Jacob and the life of a person who perhaps is here in True North, right? You need to understand you're a sinner. You need to understand that you've wronged God. You have to understand that first. But once you understand that, do you realize that what God meets you with is a promise that he will forgive you through what Jesus did? Like, that's the gospel message. That no matter what you've done, God can atone for that through Jesus. No matter the things that you've done that you're ashamed of, like, God promises forgiveness and grace. That's step one. And for Jacob, that was step one, to receive God's grace. And that's step one for you, is to humbly submit yourself to God and say, I want to do what God says in the future, but what's really important is right now that I receive God's grace. And the way we receive that is through repenting of our sin and trusting in Jesus for salvation. And then once that happens, what takes place afterwards? All good things? Well, the rest of Jacob's life is not going to be all good things. It's going to be a lot of good things, but it's going to be a lot of pain and a lot of trials and a lot of correction for the wrong that he's done. Yet, you're going to see that God is going to be good to him the whole way. And his promise is, when I get back here, I'm going to consecrate this place again. That's chapter 28. I said something about John chapter 1. Jesus quotes this, and I said he quoted it to Nathanael. Let me read that passage for you. So, John chapter 1, verse 47 says, Jesus saw a man named Nathanael. So this is fast forward thousands of years. He saw Nathanael coming towards him, and he said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Right? So basically saying this is a true son of Israel, a true son of Jacob. So we've already introduced Jacob to the story right there. And Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Right? You think I'm such, like, Jesus says, this is a good guy right here. This is a real Israelite, a real son of Jacob. And Nathanael's like, how do you know that? Right? He's kind of cynical, right? You don't know me, right? What if I'm a bad guy? You don't know who I am. That's what Nathanael says. And Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. It's like, that's random. But so Jesus can just tell you that he sees you in some place? Well, what happened was, clearly he was doing something under a fig tree, and probably what he was doing was reading the Bible or thinking or praying. This is a common place that people went to meditate in Scripture. They go out to their land, they go out to somewhere, just like you might go to a park, or you might, go somewhere in nature, and you think about God, and you maybe journal, or you pray. That's what he was doing under the fig tree. And he brings up Jacob and a fig tree, and again, who cares? Why does any of this matter? Well, Jesus goes on to say that, and Nathanael responds, he says, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. Somehow, just by bringing up Jacob and the fig tree, he's like, I know that you're really from God. Right? Probably what was happening was he was meditating on Jacob. He was probably thinking about this scene. And the reason I say that is because what Jesus says next. Jesus says, because I say to you, I see you under the fig tree, do you believe in me? You will see greater things than these. And Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So he brings up Jacob's dream. And he's like, you know what you're going to see? You're going to see that, but you know what? I'm at the top. I am the Lord. So Jesus uses that and says, you're going to see that too one day to Nathanael. Pretty amazing stuff. But this point's all about God's presence. And before we move on, I just want you to write down two passages. One is Matthew 28, verse 20, where Jesus says, I'm with you. Okay? At the end of the job title he gave us, which was to make disciples, right after that, Matthew 28, 20, Jesus says, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I'm going to be with my people as long as they're on this planet making disciples. So if you are a person who is a disciple and you're making disciples, do you know what this promise is? That Jesus will be with you. Right? So you have just as much of a promise of God's presence as Jacob did. You don't have to see a dream. You don't need to see Jacob's ladder. You don't need a vision. You don't need any of that. You just need these words from Jesus because they're a promise to you too. Another verse, Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. The author there says, we should be content with the things that we have because God has said, quote, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? I just want you to think, if you're a Christian, this first point should be a good reminder that you have no reason to ever be hopeless. You have no overriding reason ever to be hopeless. Because God says he's with you. You can have real pain. You can have devastating loss. All that can be true. But you have no reason to be hopeless. Because God says he's with you. He can even be with you in the pain that you experience. But God's still with you. That's what he promises. I think part of the reason we get to a hopeless place is because we forget that this is what God promises, or we just don't believe that. Or maybe you're a person that God is not with you, right? And you're fighting against God, and there's no affection with God. But you have no reason to be hopeless. And think about it in reverse. If you have no promise that God, the God of the universe, is with you, hopelessness is like I would think it's the expected result of living a life without God. Like, that's what's going to happen if you really think deeply, right? If you thought about, like, in philosophy, there's a lot of philosophies that get to a really dark place, and it's because they're like, we're the only ones really thinking these things through. Like nihilism, right? Like, that you really get to the end that everything is purposeless, nothing matters. Those people are trying to be consistent. Well, it's because their whole idea is life without God. That is where it ends up. If not, it's just distracting yourself until you end up getting there. But the point is, for a Christian, you never have to be hopeless because God says he's with you, just like he said it to Jacob. Now that's Genesis 28. Genesis 29, check this out. After Jacob gets this promise that God is with him, right? What would you expect from Jacob? Maybe some prayer, right? maybe some reverence of God, probably speaking about God, probably telling people, do you know the promise of God? That God is with me. That's probably what you would expect from Jacob. We don't see any of that in chapter 29. Just a spoiler, okay? Very, very little. Chapter 29, verse 1. It says, then Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. And as he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large. And when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone, probably takes a few people to do that job, from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. So, a lot about wells in the book of Genesis. The whole point is he shows up at a well. Why might that be like an encouraging sight? Right? Do you remember where Abraham's servant found a wife for Isaac? Where was it? It was at a well. It was at a well in the east. In fact, it was perhaps at this same well. We're not sure. And obviously, Jacob doesn't know, right? But he shows up at a well, and he sees people watering the flocks. And he's like, this is cool. And Jacob said, my brothers, where do you come from? So he talks to the shepherds. And they say, we are from Haran. That's good. And he said, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? Like, do you know that guy, Laban? Because Laban is his uncle. He's never met him before, but that's what his mom said. Ask for my brother. His name is Laban. And they said, yeah, we know him. And he said, is it all well with him? In other words, is he still alive? Right? And they said, it is well. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. And now all the attention turns to this girl who's walking up. And look what Jacob does. So Jacob is told, look over there, that's Rachel. That's Laban's daughter. So it's like he looks over, and look at the next thing he does. He says to the shepherds, verse 7, behold, it's still high day. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. Like, in other words, can you not be here right now? Right? Okay. So I read like a lot of commentaries throughout the week on this. I just want to give you a quote from a scholarly commentary that I just thought True North would love to hear, okay? This is from Richard Phillips in the Reformed Expository Commentary. He said, Jacob was acting like a teenage boy trying to get rid of his younger siblings so that he could be alone with his girl, okay? That was from a scholarly source that I read this week. So, I don't usually give you quotes, but that was a pretty good one, okay? So, he's saying, why don't you move on? Like, I want to be here by myself when Rachel shows up. So, does that make sense? He's talking to the shepherds. He looks over. Rachel's still a distance off. She's walking up. He's like, can you be gone? Can you get out of here? Like, just do something with the sheep. Because he wants, by the time Rachel shows up, it's just him and Rachel, okay? While he was still speaking with them, right? So this conversation, he's trying to shoo them away. Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess, right? Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, as soon as he saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Okay, what just happened? So he's like talking to them. Rachel walks up. As Rachel walks up, immediately he sees Rachel. He's like, oh, you know, I can lift this really big thing. Like I could. And he takes the stone and he moves it over. It's like, bro, that's a 3-person job. You almost saw Pastor John fall right there. He is a show-off, okay? He is acting like a teenage boy. And what does he do? Like, this whole stone is super heavy and it takes a ton of people to move. And then he's like, I got it, I can do it myself. And he moves it, and he immediately starts watering the flocks of Laban. He kind of sounds a little bit like his mother, right? Do you remember this? When his mother showed up and there was the flocks of Abraham, what does she do? She springs into action and feeds the flocks. So he's like, you know what my mama told me? My mama told me, here's how you raise up the girl, okay? Feed the flocks, okay? You better get that water out. You better move that stone, okay? What do you know about Jacob? Is he the strong big one? He's not the strong big one. He's the skinny mama's boy, okay? But he's like, I got enough strength in me to move this stone, okay? So there you go. That's what happens. If you think that was good, just keep reading, okay? So he moves the stone away. So feat of strength, like, you know, risking hernias, right? Like he's just did it. Then Jacob kissed Rachel. Whoa. Okay. This is the only kiss in the Bible from a man to a woman who's not married, okay? So, whoa, this is like big deal. So, it's like he's just moved the stone, he's just fed him. Like, it might be adding a little bit to the text, but it feels like he like picked this girl up, kissed her, and then starts crying. Okay, so he's emotional. Look what it says. Then he wept aloud, all right? Jacob, tad bit impulsive, okay, bro? Little emotional. You would tell Jacob, it's not that deep. That's what you would say. But it is to him. And Jacob told Rachel that he was his father's kinsman and he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. That's a funny scene, right? So she ran away. But like in a good way, right? She's like, I got to go tell dad. Also kind of weird. But so before we like move on to the next section, just something to notice. When have we last seen a well? When have we last seen like a potential meeting a future spouse at a well? What happened the last time was Abraham's servant didn't act. He watched Rebekah act, right? Like she fed the flocks, right? Now this time Jacob is the one who feeds the flock. So Rachel's the one like watching with anticipation right before she gets kissed, okay? What does Abraham's servant do? If you remember, Abraham's servant stopped and prayed. And he said, God brought me here. This is God's thing. God has prospered my way. Like, if you take both narratives and you kind of compare the similarities and the differences, the main difference is this. Abraham's servant stops, prays, recognizes God, does all the godly stuff. And then what does Jacob do? None of that. In fact, he's like taking matters into his own hands, making stuff happen. That's Jacob, okay? That's just really a good picture of what Jacob's like. Next, verse 13, he says, as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. There's a lot of kissing and hugging going on here. And Jacob told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you're my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him a month. Right? Okay, so now this family reunion, this is all happy, this is all exciting. So then you even see like the kiss was probably not like a, romantic kiss with Rachel. I mean, it's still a kiss, still, weird. I guess. Well, not weird. It's, Jacob definitely kissed on the first date. Okay, that's like, he missed on the kiss on the first meeting. But he also does that with his uncle. So, it's just like a Middle Eastern show of affection, right? It's like, come here, boy. All right. Can't you imagine, like, uncle? You have an uncle who does that, right? I don't. But I can imagine it. Oh, that's crazy. Michael's a pastor. He might watch this. Sorry, Uncle David. What was I saying? Oh, verse 15. That's what I was saying. So Laban's like, cool, Jacob. Glad you're here. This is exciting. You're my kinsman. You're my relative. Should you therefore serve me for nothing? Like, you've been such a good help around the house for like a month here. Would you serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wages shall be. Now, that sounds super nice, right? It sounds like, he's trying to do him a solid. But like once you know who Laban is, what you're going to realize is he's like, so what can I do to like keep you around here? Okay, I kind of want you to be around. In fact, it seems as with the dating of all this and the ages of people that he had daughters first and his sons were younger, like significantly younger than Jacob. So maybe it was like, dude, this is like having the son I've never had around the house. I really want this guy, Jacob. He's a great worker. He can obviously move the stone all by himself, so he's strong when he wants to be. So want to keep this guy around, okay? So it might not have just been like, hey, I want to help you. It might have been like, I want your help, and I can maybe help you in exchange. And then Laban had 2 daughters. Okay, here's now a parenthetical. Now we're getting a description of these 2 daughters. Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Okay, older, younger, older, younger, older, younger. When did we last hear about older, younger? Jacob and Esau, okay? Keep that in mind because that's going to be important. Leah's eyes were weak. Ooh, like, what does that mean? Like cross-eyed or like albino eyes? Or like, I don't like, what does that mean? So some people, there's a debate on this, obviously, as you can imagine. Like, either her eyes are weak means she's ugly, okay? That could be what it means. Or it could be, like, her eyes are soft in the sense that, like, what was the most attractive thing about Leah was her eyes. That's what some people think, okay? I don't think so. I think this is trying to say Leah, not super pretty, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance, okay? That's describing everything about her was great, okay, and attractive. So I think it's a contrast, okay? That's my take on it. I think it's a contrast. So Leah, yeah, not so pretty. Rachel, totally beautiful, okay? And here's more on this. Jacob loved Rachel. Nothing about Leah, right? Like, Leah did not, just, okay. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. It's like, yeah, I know Leah, but Rachel, right? That's kind of how this was. And he said, I will serve you for 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Wow, 7 years. Like, if you add up how much money that is versus the bride price, it's way more than he needs to. It's like double what the average bride price would be based on all the math. Okay, so this is a super generous offer. And then Laban's like, I guess it's better that I give you to her than I should give her to any other man, so stay with me, right? She's not married yet. So Jacob serves 7 years for Rachel. And this is the most romantic Bible verse that we have. He served 7 years. And they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her, right? That's romantic, right? Whoa, Jacob, okay. He really loves Rachel. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for the time is complete. So this is interesting. Why does he have to go do this? In fact, Laban should have been like, hey, it's been 7 years, let's have a wedding. Jacob has to initiate this, like maybe it's been 7 years. And a month, and a week. I mean, he's probably counting down the days, right? This is what people do when they get married. They count down the days to when they can get married. Jacob's probably doing the same thing, right? And dad hasn't arranged the feast yet. So Laban gathered all the people together. So who's doing this feast? Who's organizing it? Who's making it happen? It's Laban. It's his responsibility. So he does it, gets them all together, makes a feast. Verse 23, but in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her, okay? So, what happens here? I'm going to say this sarcastically, okay? Catch the sarcasm. Hey, Jacob, do we have a father and a firstborn deceiving you? Oh, that must suck. Have a father and a firstborn deceiving you? Because it seems like last chapter, you were deceiving a father, your own, and a firstborn. This is a reversal of what just took place. He steals the blessing from Esau and Isaac. And how does he do it? Well, he does it with his blind father. When does this happen? In the dark. How does he trick Isaac? Well, by pretending to be his sibling. What does Leah do? Pretend to be her own sister. Okay? This is a... where did it take place? Both of them took place in a tent. Both of them took place after a meal. Both of them took place perhaps where there's some alcohol involved, where the person who's making the decision is not totally sharp on what's taking place. There are so many similarities between how Isaac deceived his father and his older brother and how he's deceived by another father and an older sibling. Verse 24 says, Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant, which is going to be important later. Verse 25, and in the morning, behold, it was Leah, right? That was not who I thought I got married to. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you've done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Is that not dripping with a little bit of irony? Jacob's like, why'd you lie to me? It's like, hey, Jacob, you're the liar. You're the one that lied to your dad, and now guess what? Someone else's dad is lying to you. This is bad stuff. I mean, think about the deception that took place. Where's Rachel? Right? What room did they tie her up in to get her to shut up and not scream and say, Jacob, Jacob, Jacob? Like, what do they have to do to her? Oh, and Leah, by the way, willing accomplice, right? And this is their wedding night. Think about what happened and what took place here. Think about who he thinks she is, right? There's a lot of probably romantic words that are said at that point. There's probably a lot of deception that Leah has to have as she pretends to continue to be Rachel. This is terrible. Bad stuff. Horrible deception. And he says, did I not serve for Rachel? And Laban said, it's not done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Is that more twisting of the knife? Firstborns get priority here. Oh, what are you again, Jacob? Oh yeah, you're the younger. That in your stupid little country, you took over your brother. But that's not how we do it here. We honor the firstborn here. Like, this is more twisting of the knife for Jacob. He says, complete the week for this one. So it's a week-long wedding feast. And we'll give you the other, also in return for serving me another 7 years. Now Jacob's stuck. What does he do? Does he say no? Does he run? Well, he can't run from Leah. That's his wife now. Right? This marriage has been consummated. He can't go anywhere. So Jacob did so, completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And Laban also gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Jacob more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. The deceiver gets deceived, right? How do we see God's grace in that? How's he supposed to see God's grace in that? Well, point number 2, see God's grace in his discipline. He's going to discipline Jacob severely. And when God disciplines us for our sin, we often think, God is against me. God must hate me. God must not be for me if he lets me get the consequences of my actions. Let me just remind you of Psalm 23, one of the most famous chapters in the Bible, Psalm 23:4, when he just proclaims how great it is that though he walks through the valley of the shadow of death, he says, God, you are with me. And then he says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The rod is the thing that a shepherd would strike a sheep in the nose to get him back in line. He says, that is a comfort to me, that God keeps me in line. And then his staff, the outside protective agent. The point is, God shows his love for his children by keeping you from doing wrong. And by bringing pain into your life sometimes because of the wrong actions you've done. Or sometimes just to keep you from doing wrong. God can give you preemptive discipline to give you pain so that you won't do the thing that you might have done in the future. And then if you sit in your pain and think, this isn't fair, I shouldn't be experiencing this, I shouldn't be feeling this, and you think that way, just be careful, right? You don't know what God is doing. One thing that you can know is that God promises to be with you. God promised to be with Jacob. So what does Jacob do when he's disciplined? Does he get better? Does he recognize the sovereignty of God? Does he recognize God's discipline? Spoiler alert. No. Look at the next section. Genesis 29. Look at verse 31. Back in our text. This first verse is the most important in the whole section. We got a lot of children that are going to be born here. So it's the next phase of his life. When the Lord saw, who saw? The Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So God looks at Jacob and how he is as a husband and says, great, I'll respond. I'll give the wife that you don't even like, right? Leah, it's not just that she's more ugly. She's unloved now, right? Which is not fair. It's not right. What should Jacob do? Like, seriously, think about it. At this point, what's the right thing for Jacob to do? Hey, I deceived my dad. My father-in-law deceived me. Okay. I'm going to live with it. I'm going to serve. I'm going to love both these ladies because you know what? As a wife, what do they deserve from me as a husband? Love, affection, care, sympathy. That's what they deserve from me. So I'm going to give it. Now I got two, didn't want to, wanted one. Right? He only wanted to marry Rachel, but now he has two. And the two happen to be sisters. So that's a whole problem in how they fight and they don't like each other and they're against each other. That's a whole problem. But now he's got this responsibility. What should he do? He should act in a godly manner. He does not act in a godly manner. He's selfish and he doesn't like Leah. Leah is the victim in this situation. Although, she's the one who lied, just like Jacob. Everyone hurts in this passage. But notice it says the Lord saw, and then the Lord opened a womb and then closed a womb. It's another just important thing in this text. God is the one who is in charge of who has kids and when they have kids, right? God is the one who gives life or prevents life from happening. That is clear in this text with all these babies that are about to be born, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, verse 32, what happens? Leah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. Right? How sad is that? That you name your kid, behold, the son. That's what Reuben is. Behold, and then a son. Like, look, it's a son. It's almost like, hey, husband, look. Here's a son. Will you love me now? Right? Even that. Shouldn't Jacob be rebuked by his wife's really sad naming of this kid? What should Jacob do? Like, yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should love you anyway, right? But yes, I love you now. No, he doesn't. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he's given me this son also. And she named him Simeon. Simeon means heard by God. So Leah's like, God hears me, right? My husband doesn't hear me, right? My husband doesn't love me. But maybe he gave me 2 sons now so that my husband will finally hear me too. And again, she conceived and bore a son. And she said, now this time, the 3rd time, my husband will be attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore, his name shall be called Levi. Levi means attached, okay? Do you see how sad this is? Okay? How, like, it doesn't, just spoiler alert, it takes 9 months, right, to conceive a child, okay? Or not to conceive a child, to carry a child a full term, okay? So this is like years of time here. This took some time. Jacob could have responded right. He doesn't respond right. He doesn't choose to love Leah. And why? Because she lied, right? She deceived. This whole relationship was built upon a lie. It's all bad, right? There's no exclusivity in this marriage, right? There's no mutual love and affection. It's bad. And she conceived again and bore a son. And she said, this time I'm just going to praise God. My 4th son, who cares about my husband? I'm going to praise the Lord. So she called his name Judah. And she ceased from bearing, right? Which sounds like she became infertile or something or got too old. That's not what happens. She's going to have more kids. Do you know what this means? Rachel said, you're not going to sleep in that tent anymore. Or Jacob said, I'm sick of having kids with you. I'm going to be with Rachel all the time. Like, this was a withholding of marital relations, if you want to put it in an adult way, right? Like, this is what happened there. Because she can still have kids, because she's going to have more kids. Verse 1 of chapter 30. Then Rachel saw. So who saw in 31? The Lord saw that Leah was hated. Now Rachel sees that Jacob bore no children, and she envied her sister. And she said to Jacob, give me children or I will die. I shall die. Right? I want to kill myself if I can't have a kid. Right? And Jacob's like mad at that, as you could expect. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. Like, dude, it's not my fault, right? Here, clearly, he's having kids. Right? He says, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Look what he does. Like, hey, at least you got that part right, Jacob. God has withheld. But there's never like a reason why that is. Why is this happening? Okay? Because of Jacob's lack of leadership, which makes his wives fight. He hates one of his wives, right? And then he loves another. But that love even, it's like, oh, it's so good that I love my wife. It's like, you don't love, no, but you don't love Leah. You're acting in the wrong way here. Remember last time there was a wife that was barren? It was Rebekah. You know what the text very clearly says in Genesis 25? That Isaac and Rebekah could have no children. So Isaac prayed to the Lord for her, and God heard. You know what Jacob does? Yeah, he blames God. He says, yeah, God just hasn't given you a kid. But he doesn't do anything to solve the problem. He doesn't pray. He doesn't intercede on his wife's behalf. He actually lets this problem get worse. Look what he does next. Verse 3. And then she said, here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her, right? I thought we weren't supposed to do that. We already saw that surrogacy was wrong here. We already saw that going into some other lady like, Hagar was wrong to have these illegitimate children. Like, let's not do that. Let's stake in God's plan. We're not going to go outside of that, right? Because he knows that, because his family history. He should know that. He should be leading. He should be saying, okay, we can't have kids. Like, let's pray and trust God, right? No. He just says, okay. So, verse 4. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Wow, that's great, isn't it? Yeah, I guess. And Rachel said, God has judged me, which sounds like God hates me. That's not what it means. She's like, God heard my voice. He has heard my voice, and he's given me a son. Therefore, I shall call his name Judge. That's what Dan means. Dan means judge. And then you know what Rachel says? Do it again, okay? Which is also kind of weird, right? Even when it comes to all this like sex that's happening, it's like, it's all, happening based on what these women want, and then they're sending their husband to go with some other woman. Like, this is bad stuff, okay? This is outside of God's plans. This is not good. So Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings, I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. Okay. You just named these two kids, Dan and Naphtali, to say, dunk on you, sister. Like, she's naming these kids not because, like, oh, I'm so glad I have a kid, or thank you, God. She's like, see, na, I can have a kid too, just not me, but like, that's what's happening here. This is bad, okay? Also, it's kind of strange that all these children are named by their mother, okay? Just another, maybe like Jacob's like out of this, right? Because shouldn't Jacob say no? Jacob should say no. Okay. Then Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, right? He's not sleeping with me anymore. So she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob. Said, maybe you'll sleep with her. You want to sleep with her, right? If you sleep with her, then her kids are my kids. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Okay, Jacob, again, no, not going to do this. He's like, yeah, fine, whatever. Jacob is the passive person in all this chapter. Very interesting. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad, which Gad is a happy word. And then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. What? Why did this happen again? And Leah said, happy am I, for women shall call me happy. So she called his name Asher. So Leah calls these kids their names, but they're happy names. But they're still happy because look at me, now I can have kids. Rachel, you still can't have any kids, right? Wow. Verse 14. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben, the oldest, now is, at some age, he's been a lot of kids at this point, right? Although the Bilhah and Zilpah's kids could overlap because they're different women, right? So it doesn't have to be like a year apart. They could be born around the same time. But it says in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes, some fruit, some plant that they used to believe would like make you more fertile. It's even quoted in the Song of Solomon. It was like this plant that they thought could do that, right? So they find this plant, and Rachel says to Leah, give me some of your son's mandrakes. Like, give me those, like, that pill or that drug. Like, I want it. You don't need it because, my husband's not even sleeping with you anymore, so you don't even need it. Plus, you're fertile anyway, so why don't you give me some of that? And she's like, no, like, you stole my husband. You want the pills? You want the drugs as well? And then Rachel said, okay, well, he can sleep with you one night in exchange for all your son's mandrakes. And when Jacob came in from the field, Leah said, hey, you have to stay with me tonight, for I've hired you, right? This is messed up. I hired you with my son's mandrakes. And Jacob came in from the field, did all that, and he lay with her that night. And you think, well, one night's probably not going to do it. Well, guess what happened? And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she calls his name Wages, Issachar, okay? Do you see how messed up this is? Any time along the way, Jacob could have said, nope, not going to happen. Not going to happen. Point number 3, just so you write it down. See God's grace in your failures, okay? Jacob is failing over and over again. And then what does God do? Gives him sons. As you write that down, verse 19 says, then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son, another son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, which is the word Zebulun, honor, because I've borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. Zebulun means honor. You know what it also means? Dwelling. Like, maybe my husband will show up because now I've given him 6 sons. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her Dinah, which Dinah is just the female version of the name Dan. So, it doesn't say why. But maybe it's because, like, Rachel's servant had a Dan, a boy. They have a girl. It's like, okay, I'll name him Dan, Yell, right? Does that make sense? Danielle, like a version of Daniel. Okay. Then, verse 22, God remembered Rachel. And God listened to her. God listened to her. She hasn't been praying. Well, seems like some kind of change of heart from Rachel. We see that from that, but also because of what Rachel names him. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord, the only time the covenant name of God, Yahweh, has been mentioned here, Rachel says, because God may add to me another son. Which is like, you're getting kind of greedy, Rachel. You've been waiting a long time for one. Like, let's slow down and thinking about 2. But it's a statement of God's like confidence in God, right? And what happens right after that? As soon as Rachel had born Joseph, Jacob said, all right, I think it's time for us to go, okay? Been a long time here. It's been like 14, 15, 20 years. I think we need to leave. So then he's like, let's go away. And the rest of this section from chapter 30 and 31 is all him trying to scheme how to get home. okay? And we won't talk about all of it, but going back to the idea of this point, see God's grace in your failures. This is a chapter full of failures. Failures of leadership, failures of lack of prayer, right? This is just another principle here. Jacob can be a schemer, or he can be a man of prayer. Can't really be both, okay? He's either going to do it on his own, or he's going to trust God. Or in this passage, he's going to be the passive husband that doesn't do much, right? How is God's grace in this, right? The point is, see God's grace in your failures. He has sons. These sons become extremely important. I mean, even just think of Judah and Levi. Think about what they're going to do. All of the priests will come from the tribe of Levi. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, will be incarnate from the line of Judah. King David from the line of Judah. I mean, the very, very important people that you know in the Bible came from this family. There's God's grace in that. And even in your failures, right? If you do wrong, right, even if you experience the discipline of God, I want you to have the adult and mature perspective to say, where is God's grace in this? Maybe in the response that God gives, maybe even the protection that God gives, or maybe even the good outcomes. Because God sometimes can use even your failures to produce a good outcome. That doesn't make the thing right. None of this was right. This was wrong, okay? But God used it for good. That's going to be the main lesson we learn at the very end of the book. Joseph will actually say that. He'll say to his brothers, you meant all this stuff for evil, but God meant it for good. Yeah, at the end here, I feel like we're just going to not skip it completely, but chapter 30 and 31, Joseph's born. Jacob's like, we got to go home. He talks to Laban. He's like, we got to get out of here. We want to leave. Laban doesn't want him to leave because all these kids, all these grandkids, like they all need to stick around. But what God's going to do is, I think, miraculously provide for Jacob in a way that doesn't make sense. It's not natural, it's supernatural. So point number 4, you can write down like this: see God's grace in his provision and his protection. Because that's what takes place here. God provides and God protects. So Laban, when Jacob's like, I want to leave, Laban's like, I don't want you to leave. In fact, I did some like sneaky divination stuff, and I found out from all the demons that like, you're the reason I'm so rich now. So I don't want you to leave. And then Jacob's like, well, I want to leave. How about this? What if I give you, what if I work for you and we take all your flock, right? Because we're shepherds. And I'll just take all the good ones and I'll put them in one flock. And then all the like bad ones, the spotted, the speckled, I'll remove those and I'll just shepherd those, the ones you don't want. I'll just take the leftovers in the trash. I'll kind of raise that flock. And then whatever kids come from that flock, I'll just take that. But you keep all your good ones, and like I'll keep providing for all your good ones. Sound like a deal? And Laban's like, sure, like that's a great deal. And then you know what Laban does? Laban's like, I'm going to take out all the speckled and spotted ones away so Jacob can't even have them. So he's going to be working with only a few. So Jacob's at the disadvantage. And then Laban is like, all right, we'll see what happens now. And back to Jacob. Jacob takes these sticks, exposes some white, has a bunch of sticks, exposes the white that's inside of them so that he makes this like almost a mural that is spotted and speckled like the flock that he has. And then these spotted and speckled sheep and goats and stuff, they all have kids, they reproduce, and it seems like all the healthy ones come from Jacob's flock. Like this is not a natural, like, hey, he did a science experiment and he found out that like if you show them like a spotted and speckled wall, they'll all have healthy kids. Like this was a God thing. So God provided, so much so Laban's sons step up. They've grown at this point. They're like, Jacob must be stealing from us because God's making him so rich. And this is the same pattern we saw with Abraham and Isaac. God just keeps prospering him. Then what takes place after that is they falsely accuse him. They say, you're stealing. So Jacob calls a family meeting, pulls Leah, pulls Rachel, probably a rare family meeting. They didn't all get together very much. But he's like, we're going out to the field, right? It's like, what are we doing at the field? And he's like, all right, your dad is such a liar. He's so greedy. We're leaving, okay? And he retells the story. And the daughter's like, totally. We hate our dad too, right? It's like, okay. So they're like, we'll leave. And they leave. And as they leave, there's a play on words that says that Jacob stole the hearts of Laban. So he tricked Laban. And then Rachel stole the household gods, which was like, what are the household gods? The idols that Laban worshipped. So she steals those gods, and then Laban finds out that they're stolen. He pursues them. It's like he's going to overtake them, but God warns Laban in a dream. He says, no, don't do that. They have this conversation. And he's like, you stole my household gods. And Jacob's like, I didn't steal your household gods. In fact, if anyone stole your household gods, they deserve to die. And he didn't know Rachel took them. So Laban looks around, and he feels all around. He actually goes into all the tents, feels around for the gods. And Rachel is sitting in her tent on her camel's saddle where she's hidden them. And she says that she's on her period, so she can't get up. She says, the way of women is with me. I can't get up. And so literally, that's what the text says. You can read it if you think I'm making it up. And she's like showing these gods, these false gods, they're nothing. Now, we don't know why she took them. Did she want to worship them? I don't think so. Did she want to sell them? I don't know. Or did she want her dad not to use these false gods anymore? Maybe, because she like disgraces them and dishonors them. And then they walk away, which, by the way, the next person that's going to die is going to be Rachel, right? Even though it's in a different scene, that's the next person in our narrative to die is Rachel. Then Jacob just has it out with his father-in-law. He just yells at him, like, you've been terrible, you've been bad. And then they make a covenant and a treaty. Why? Right? Well, every character here, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, at the end of their time, they finally come to this place where like everyone respects them. And this is a way, by the way, this whole scene of Jacob going into a foreign land and then coming out rich and prosperous, that's exactly what these people of Genesis, who are hearing the book for the first time, that's what they just experienced. They went down into Egypt, they went into a foreign land, and they come out prosperous in a miraculous way. That's exactly what happened with Jacob. So like they look to their forefather, and it's just repeating of history over and over again. Now, that's a lot of the story. Just the big thing, right? What do we need to learn here as Christians? Okay? God has promised to be with you. Right? God has promised to discipline you. But I want you to have the perspective to look at the things that God brings in your life and to say, what's discipline from God? What's not discipline, but I don't know why God's bringing it in, but what's the point? What's God bringing into my life, right? I don't know what God will bring into your life, but I do know this, that he's going to work those things out so that you'll be more like him. And some of that's going to include some pain. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday night. Let me pray for you right now as we head out. God, we're humbled by looking at this sad story. We see the bad activities and actions of Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Laban. But we know that we want to be people who are thinking about pleasing you first and foremost. Pray for all of us as we consider our life this week and the challenges that you'll bring into all of our lives. I pray that we will react the right way, that we won't be active when we should be passive like Jacob was at the beginning, and we won't be passive when we should be active and leading spiritually like Jacob was in the next chapter. So please help us with this. We know we need your help to have wisdom on how to live right. And we just pray we learn from the pain you bring in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.